critique of those kind of plant takes that don't really acknowledge that, and maybe observing that commodity and resource frontier issue at the deeper level, the ideological, cosmological, ontological level, ontoepistemic issues, and so on. And this is based on, and then I have a like application of that theory of how to study extractivisms in different degrees and characteristics based on the soybean corn monocultures in Brazil's Mato Grosso. Yes, please. So here is a photo from the field. I'm with the farmer there in this area. It's a transition area between the Cerrado and Amazon in the Brazilian context. So a few decades ago, that used to be a tall forest. So now you can see only until the horizon soybean. So it's a clear example of this transformation, radical redistribution of existences in that space. There used to be millions of different species and not species, but living beings in that space, and a multitude of species in the forest landscape. And now you see that it's only allowed for the soybean and then corn as a cover crop to exist there. So it's a radical decrease in the variety of existences in the web of life, but then really like a radical increase in the number of that soybean that exists there for particular purposes. Next. And here is a contrast. So this is how, for example, it looks like in one of the Brazilian extractive reserves, which are like multiple use conservation areas where people can live inside there, and still the nature is protected. Yes. And I also draw on the Finnish experiences. So this is not only about the global south, but for example, here's a picture in southern Karelia of a recent clear cut. So it has been 2 years clear cut that area close to the place where I used to live. So that used to be a moss covered old forest, and it could have easily been protected, but our neighbor, the owner, didn't want to protect it, but wanted to clear cut it and then even do the dredges there. So yeah. So here is a figure about the rise of soybean, corn, and sugarcane plantations in Brazil. So you can see that especially soybean has increased. Now there are like over 45 million hectares of soybeans plantations in Brazil, which is far more than the whole of Finland. Next. And here are some of the areas in the Amazon that I did field research in. So different parts of the Amazon. Same photo, yeah, of the deforestation. So here is the village called, a current city called Sinop. It comes from the Sociedade Imobiliária Noroeste do Paraná, which is like the Northeastern Paraná real estate company. So during the dictatorship in the 1970s, the Brazilian government gave concession for this company to open these areas of the Amazon where these Panará indigenous people used to live. That was the center place of their village, where they built the grid for the new city. And on the right-hand side, you can see how it is now. So here you can see also the quite recent radical transformation in terms of existences in that space. And the Panará, which used to have like 7,000 people, only a few survived, and most of them forcefully moved elsewhere or died to diseases and so on. And here is one of the remnants, so they are living now in the favela shanty towns in the area. Yeah. And this is how the forest looks like now next to the Sinop. Yeah. So I'm asking here in this existential political economy like 4 key questions for how to study these existences. First, you can ask who or what exists in that particular case. How do the locals see that? So I'm using interviews, talking with the people, walking with them in the forests, and I'm walking both with the producers and not and then also other kind of people like of the resistance and so on. How they can exist. So what is the quality of existence? In which time and or how long they can exist. So that's the third one. So for example, let's say industrial meat production, how long does the animal living there? And also the conception of time. So I'm also looking at these Amerindian viewpoints, because in many of those viewpoints in cosmologies in the Amerindian Amazonian indigenous people, they don't have like a linear time like we have. So it's more like circular. So you can also approach those kind of issues with that framework. And then fourth, who are the key entities deciding and contesting the rights to exist? So looking at the conflicts and politics. Yes. Yes, please. So here you see some of the targets of the pesticides used. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and here you can see the chicken farms next to the soybean plantations. So most of the soybeans go to feed, and then you can, analyze this more at the global level, so scaling up. So first you have like a radical redistribution of existences at the point of extraction at that forest area. But then when it goes up the scale, you also have a radical redistribution in the production chain. So you have 20,000 chicken in each of those places, and when the meat goes to slaughterhouses, there also the work is very monotonized. So it's also radical redistribution of the existences of those workers. And then, of course, in the fast food chain, when you are selling the food, so it also affects the labor and their work. Yeah. So here are kind of like what I'm saying is that extractivism shouldn't be just like black and white. It shouldn't be like either you are extractivist or you are not, but there are degrees. So you can be hyper-extractivist, partially extractivist, or like in the case of most indigenous tribes in the Amazon, non-extractivist, or with the case of like radical resistance movements like the Brazilian landless workers movement, which are occupying corporate plantations and then turning them into agroecological, agroforestry places, and anti-extractivist. And there are 4 practices that you can study, like erase life forms, expand monocultures, produce barren and toxic wasted environments, and create inequalities, class relations. So here are some examples from the book. I won't go into detail though into those, how you can use a table to study those differences. Next. Yeah, so I already talked a little bit about that. So you can study the commodity chain, the logistical pathways, what happens there, and so on. Yes, please. So here are some other books. This Clear Cut is coming out soon. So that's looking at the Amazon and Finland, and especially the political economic deeper causes for forest removals, deforestation, and looking at the gold mining, illegal gold mining, and the expansion of so-called narcocarimbo in the Amazon, which is like organized crime entering this business to launder money, and then finish industrial forestry, and then the soybean and land grabbing and ranching business in the Amazon. Yes. Yeah. So there are some kind of like, there's a theoretical part in that book on existences. So I am basing that on the work on world ecology, for example, by Jason Moore, which talks about the kind of cheapening of nature, and is also like post-Cartesian or criticizing this nature society dualism. And so is also the political ontology in Latin America, Placer de la Cadena. And then, of course, you have the agrarian political economy and studies on extractivism. Yes.
Hello again. So this talk will concern decoloniality and decolonial thinking, which we have been quite drawing on. It has been quite instrumental in our work over the past 5 years. Next slide. Okay, yeah, that's. But as you can see here, rather than featuring a specific work, this speech will be an overview of how we have approached the decolonial thinking in our work. To critique the business as usual policies and governance instruments, but also to hopefully help imagine or help co-create a collective imagination of different ways of engaging, responding, and relating to planetary health and the poly-crisis, socio-ecological crisis. Mostly we have been inspired and using the decolonial theory praxis in the context of environmental justice, conceptualizing and contextualizing the colonial and what we have called the colonial environmental justice. So here are some examples of the work where we have where we take the decolonial gaze to some of the policies we study. Mostly the focus is on the EU bioeconomy, but also there are other policies that we look at, including, for instance, the EU DER, that is the European Union Deforestation Regulation, and also the EU, what is it? Well, it will come one of them. I think the landscape restoration, yes, forest landscape restoration policies and initiatives. Okay, so next slide. Yes, thank you. In this talk, I will spend quite some time acknowledging the colonial thinking struggle as well that informs academic research today, including indigenous philosophies, science, and struggle that informs the research. So then I will have a short overview of the decolonial environmental justice, so that refers to that, as contextualized and conceptualized one of them in much of our work or many of our works. And then just few examples of critiques and imagine different trajectories in the studied policy context. Next slide. So obviously I'm not aiming to define decoloniality, but I wanted to a little bit say how I personally, I guess I should speak in my own terms, how I have approached this body of literature, but also field more at large. So I find the recognition that logics, mindsets, political and economic structures that were used to establish the European colonial project and legitimize all the hierarchies of worth and domination during that colonial project are still in place today, obviously in different forms, but yes, in place today, as are those very hierarchies that were established. So this recognition is important, but also then the coloniality is also about doing our part to address it. And this can, in my view, and some not all scholars of decoloniality will agree about this, what actually constitute decoloniality. But in my view, it will be very much dependent on the context, on the specific violence that is being inflicted. So yeah, we can go on. But it's a lot about that. It's fine. It's about that unlearning and undoing harmful hierarchies, as I mentioned, and the dominations and violence and so on. All right. So in this next slide, I wanted to acknowledge some of the names behind the decolonial thinking and to emphasize that struggles against European colonial project is at the very core of what today we refer as theory or so on, because of course this is there in the background, but it's not always acknowledged. The discussion dates back to those anti-colonial struggles across the colonized lands. It's not only Latin America, it's also Africa, nowadays Australia and New Zealand. And when I say nowadays, I mean nowadays African Asian countries, Australia and New Zealand include, and so all the global South, and others that are post-colonial states. I picked two books by Kwame and Nkrumah, someone that you wouldn't see as a name in the colonial thinking. For those who know, he was a Ghanaian politician, political theorist, and revolutionary who served as a prime minister of the Gold Coast from 1952 and 1957 when Ghana gained independence, and later as a president of Ghana until he was removed by the imperial powers. Many of us have read more temporary works. Can you put another click? Like the names we are seeing, so Quijano, Mignolo, and I just please read for yourself how this is seen in the mainstream decolonial theory and thinking. But I wanted to emphasize also it's an invitation to broaden our perspectives towards the rest of the global South struggles in shaping the colonial political and intellectual project. Next one. Similarly, here is just some indigenous scholars that have shaped my understanding. I should say that obviously this is just a very few scholars, limited to those that I have read and have informed my thinking about decolonial environmental justice, for instance, but also some other wider ideas about indigenous understanding and notions of justice. And again, the next slide. So here we see in the yellow words, I picked some of those very relevant for today framing of multi-species justice or more than human lens, but also they are really key notions emerging from the indigenous notions of indigenous notions of justice. Next slide. So I referred that we use the decolonial environmental justice framework. In these first two works, we open up and dedicate most of the papers to the framework, developing the framework, but also other two sources have been examples of literature that also engage with the decolonial environmental justice framework. So I'm not going to go in talking too much about it, but you can take just the next slide. Yes. So the framework we have been using in some of these works in reference of those papers that you saw in the beginning, it's basically an invitation to go beyond the most common three dimensions of environmental justice. So to rethink really the very logics based on which these dimensions of justice are framed and understood. So let's say if we talk about distributional justice, an invitation to go beyond it and question the nature of, question the human nature divide, or in terms of recognition, also discuss the ontological and epistemic justices and injustices, and in terms of just procedural justice or participation in state and colonial or whatever initiatives and policies, thinking about and discussing the self-determination and self-governance. And then we can just try, yes. So obviously these are just, I guess what I can hope to say the most to capture in this short time is that we have tried in a lot of this work to identify some of the problems and then try to think beyond the current ways of, so for instance, beyond the human nature duality, beyond the logic of growth and techno-scientific solutions, beyond global competitiveness and so on. So this is the first paper of that does this, and I stay quite at the like a general level here. In the next one, with a couple of colleagues, we are going a bit more in depth. It's still about the EU bioeconomy, but we really open up and think it's not about providing solutions at all. It's not about that, but still we are challenged to, we are always asked, oh, you criticize, what's your suggestions? What's your solutions? So it's not a solution, obviously, and I can self-reflect on that, whether this approach of providing solutions is colonial as well, but in the scientific articles, we do a little bit of that. So on the next slide, in the latest paper, we have this flower of change, and we try to pick out some action points and 47 associated suggestions for change in existing, also bringing up existing examples of doing things differently across the world. And then next, how am I doing with time? 2 minutes. Okay, so this is the example of the forest landscape restoration. If you can click again. A similar pattern, we have some major barriers for locally just, equitable, and effective forest landscape restoration initiatives, and then enabling factors for it. Obviously, as I said, I'm not going into them, but it was interesting to challenge a bit and to pick up like problematizing global while ignoring local knowledge systems, and strategically targeting small scale rather than large scale degradation drivers and livelihoods, and offshoring burdens of global landscapes. So it's quite specific to the maybe forest landscape restoration. What we did in that paper, the next slide, you can see that as quite common for social scientists, we we ended up with a lot of questions, guiding questions, what we need to take into consideration, either as practitioners, but also as researchers, when you can also do that, yeah, yes. So we put these questions out there, either to be used as, if someone wants to do policy evaluation, they can. If researchers want to do a critique or analysis of a certain policy, that also hopefully these questions are useful. And I think I am in time, because I just want to still say, I think this is the last slide. Yes, thank you.
Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to share some insights from a case I worked on the Just Group project in Ghana. It's amazing to speak after Professor Kröger and also Professor Ramcilovic-Suominen, because I think their work quite provide a very firm foundation. So I should not like to waste any time. Just very briefly, myself, I don't really know what I am these days. I think at some point I used to say I'm a political ecologist. Now I don't know what I am. Actually, I'm still trying to find out what I really am. But basically, I try to do a lot of work using a lot of ethnographic approaches, staying there for a very long time in communities, holding a lot of community meetings, a lot of interviews, and a lot of observations to try to bring specific issues, critique power, but also speak about a lot of issues around environmental justice, amongst others. Next slide. But for this specific talk, I should like to speak to how the bioeconomy as organizing and as important as it is in some spheres can be misappropriated to as it were met out a lot of injustice in communities. Next slide, please. Next slide. I wanted to open with a short video, but in the interest of time, I'm sure we will share the slides so you can watch this, but I think you won't miss much. I'll try as much as possible to touch on the issues covered in the videos. Next, 2 times. Good, but basically today I should like to speak to 3 things. So we can think of the bioeconomy, again, we can have a conversation on that. We can think of the bioeconomy based on how the EU has defined it and how several others have defined it afterwards. But I guess the core impulse is the sort of the production and transformation of biomass into multiple streams, and also using their waste streams. But in the context of the African Plantation for Sustainable Development, I should like to speak about 3 things. What counts as bioeconomy or green transition in that specific case? For whom that green transition or bioeconomy is implemented, but also who is making decisions with regards to that. The APSD, or African Plantation for Sustainable Development, operates a bit more in the middle parts of Ghana. Next slide. But to help you have a bit of a context as to how APSD came to work in Ghana, so starting around the 70s, there was a Norwegian investor who really studied in Harvard and then moved to Brazil and invested in plantations, pulp and paper, and he made quite a lot of money from there. He kept making a lot of money. At some point, he was making annual profits in excess of $500 million. But then somehow the business model changed a bit. Instead of focusing on pulp and paper, as Musia and co showed, they began focusing on the market and trading in derivatives and others. So as with many companies during the financial crisis of 2007-2008, they took a massive hit. Actually, they suffered to the tune of about $9.1 billion in losses. So they became insolvent. And luckily, were bailed out to form a merger with VCP, which was also one of their sort of competitors, similar business model, into what is now perhaps the largest pulp and paper company in the world, where they received a bailout to the tune of 1.35 million. So what is really interesting is that the timing of these bailouts, and so again, a cycle of accumulation was over, coincided very well with this investor's decision to now move into Ghana to seek new frontiers after he received that bailout. So from there, in total, it's managed to secure about 82,000 hectares of communal lands. But with this specific case, it's actually even more than that. There are some that really came into serious conflicts with communities and violence, and so those are court issues. So I would really not speak to that. But with this specific case, I'm speaking about the APS, one of its operations where it has about 23,000 hectares of communal lands. I will speak a bit about how it acquired the land and a lot of the processes involved, and whether or not, in many ways, I think there you don't really see a complete extractivism or green extractivism like in Markus's case. Again, I will speak a bit about why that is the case, but how we can still use green extractivism as a lens to look at that. So to understand APSD's work, what you see here is a very confidential document we managed to secure, which is the environmental and social impact assessment. Why it's confidential, I don't know, but we literally have to, for weeks, pull very key contacts with the Environmental Protection Agency in order to be able to scan this 500-page document page by page. Why that was important was that we needed information to triangulate a lot of the experiences and narratives that communities were providing us. And in many ways, that was very useful. But apart from that, also we spent a lot of time in the communities. You can see me there enjoying some really nice meals on the farm. Again, also, even within the concession, we managed after minute attempts there. It was really very important. I didn't know how influential the Fin Fund was. They were the people who were able to somehow, by mentioning them, was able to get an interview with this company after multiple tries. And also, I met some really interesting superheroes, like the woman there. So it's not all superheroes that are in Cape. You could see her cycling and carrying things on the head with both hands on the handle. I don't know how she does that, but I felt that was really nice. But I also observed a lot of land use conflicts that have emerged from this acquisition, because essentially all where the company now operates used to be farmlands. So now more and more, you can even see that the land use is changing. So instead of crops, people are beginning to grow even things like cashew and mango, because then that becomes a way of securing their access to the land, the limited land that is available. With the next one too. And then also what was also interesting is that although, as I will show, there's a lot of mechanisms the company tries to use to quash resistance, there are still some indications of agency in the communities. And here, for example, you see people this is literally their home, having very temporary structures so that they can farm in places that may be a bit far away from where the company can monitor them frequently, amongst others. And so in a lot of cases here, this maybe perhaps highlights the divide. So on the right is the company's eucalyptus monoculture, and on the left are some farmlands, but then even access roads and the rest are all blocked off. And there are communities who actually even live inside the plantation. So even getting access to the outside world becomes a challenge. So basically, the main themes I would like to highlight is the one thing that APSD did quite strongly is that over the years, it's found very creative ways to package and repackage its operations as bioeconomy, and that it was going to generate clean energy, produce biomass, convert it into electricity, which can sometimes be a challenge in Ghana. And so all this really gave it a sort of legitimacy in the eyes of the states and among several actors to enable its work. Quite apart from that, it really likes to articulate that it is sustainable. The name of the company itself, it's African Plantation for Sustainable Development. So it keeps appropriating this over and over again to show that it's a sustainable company. More and more, it tries to align itself with international platforms and organizations that are promoting circular bioeconomy and sustainable production. But actually what you see in practice is, although the company frames a lot of the landscape as degraded, this is degraded and this is restored. We can have a lot of questions. Again, Markus spoke about existences and extensions amongst others. We can have conversations around all that maybe later on. Quickly. In terms of bioeconomy for whom, what we really see is that from even the environmental and social impact assessment, you can see there's a lot of win-win narratives. There'll be lots of jobs, there'll be lots of opportunities. But what we really see is now we don't even really see win-loss, because the company itself is also in limbo. So the company itself is also losing. So it's more like a lose-lose, the classic lose-lose. situation which I've never seen before. And what it's also doing is it's using a kind of a stepwise approach to dispossessed communities. So those that are within the concession now, here's a list of rules to live by. We can go through them, but the last one is any action of an individual or community suspected to be born out of retaliation of any kind will be dealt with seriously. So again, it has its own ways of trying to keep the communities at bay. And one of the ways is that is through an alliance with the states where it has security officials, amongst others, to keep the communities at bay. But it's also important. Another tool it uses also is water, access to water. This is an area where for maybe half the year there's no water. So the next one. So what the company has done is, even though there's no water there, it has about 6 dams within the lease area. And so if you need access to this water, then you have to comply you have to go by the rules so that you can have water. So that's also one of the tools it uses. And the last thing I should like to speak about is in terms of who makes decisions in this, that has enabled this kind of infrastructure for grain extractivism to occur. I think it's at the intersection of the traditional authority, but also the state in many ways, because extractivism has to do with land-intensive investment, as we see with the monocultures. But in many ways, you see a lot of loopholes, one of which is that it's within Ghana's legal framework, it's not very clear the distinction between land acquisition and authorization of a project through the environmental and social impact assessment and others. So in a way, the ECR or environmental and social impact assessment then becomes a way of legitimizing a sort of a land grabbing that has already taken place. And so then the companies then frame that as, oh, we consulted the communities, but actually that consultation was for the project and not for whether or not to take or work on their land. And another thing that also comes out quite strongly is that the issue of consent is not treated very properly in the legal framework, and how that should be established, especially in relation to land. That's a gray area, and that also creates a lot of room for this to fester. Again, even the same within the legal framework, the renewal of the environmental permit, the name again also speaks to it, focuses on the environmental aspects of the company's operation. So nobody looks at the social dimensions and whether or not the promises the company made, among others, are being honored when it's renewing its permits. So again, that is also on the blind side of regulation, amongst others. Notwithstanding, you see, again, as I mentioned, some individuals using very creative ways to grow annual crops, 3 months, 4 months, because at any point, the company can find you out and clear your farm down, amongst others. So to really sum up, what you see is that, one, no bioenergy plant has been built. The land has been taken over. The company is not letting go of that. That one it already has. But more and more, because there are a lot of questions have been even raised in Ghana's parliament, and then there's been a call for an investigation into this company's operations. But that notwithstanding, the company is more and more using new forms of association. And this is a project, a 22 million euro project that is going on. Somehow managed to find itself there again to argue that it's operating sustainably, amongst others. So again, new tools, but the same modalities are still very much in place. So yeah, I raised 3 questions towards the end, which I'm also curious to, in the course of the discussion, hear people's opinion on. One concerns how this issue of one-off consent, how do we engage that also from a theoretical perspective, because this is not really limited to Ghana. I've seen also similar cases in Brazil, other African countries, amongst others. How do we make consent a recursive process such that communities are not disenfranchised once and for all? Another one is also in cases where there's a lot of cases of abandoned land grabs. How do communities reclaim some of these spaces and their lives and livelihoods? But also, I'm curious if anyone has seen any form of land-intensive bioeconomy innovation or initiative working. I'm very curious, and I'd like to hear more about what has made those successful. I should like to thank you very much and look forward to the discussions.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. My name is Kwaku Agyei. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Forestry at Nkrumah University in Ghana. So this presentation is based on a paper that I wrote with Sabaheta that we call it, this has a long title, I decided to shorten it a bit. How state justice system institutionalizes injustice, the case of Farmer-Herder conflict in Agogo. So basically this case tends to reflect shows how the so-called legal apparatus or legal system are fraught with colonial legacies, and they tend to perpetuate injustice, as we will see later on. Yes. So I'm going to give a bit of context, background for you to understand a bit my case. Then I'll move into results, and then I'll also end up with some questions for us to reflect a bit about. Yes. So this is just for those of us who don't know, maybe Ghana. This is a map of Ghana, and the case I'll be talking about concerns somewhere located somewhere here in the northern part of Ghana. It's about the people in a place called Asante Achim North municipality, where the district capital is called Agogo. So these people are basically crop farmers, and historically they have engaged in farming as subsistence kind of level, where they were growing crops like cassava, yam, maize, and plantain. But in the last 60, 70 years, they have moved into modern agricultural development. So, for example, they've moved into commercial plantain cultivation, where they export plantains. And then they have also diversified into vegetables, where they plant pepper, tomatoes, and onion, also on commercial kind of scale. Over there, they also have a number of agricultural agro-processing initiatives. So, for example, they have about 20 acres of land area where they put into cassava kind of cultivation. So basically, in this area, farming or crop farming happens to be the key backbone of their local economy. And Agogo, the entire district is also very important when it comes to food planning in the Ghanaian agricultural kind of landscape. Next slide. But this same region, the Agogo landscape also happens to be an area where over the years, Fulani pastoralists, cattle producers have tended to locate, and it also has a history. So here we have the map of Sahara. So we have the North Africa and the coastal belts in Western Africa. So people in the Sahara region, because of their landscape, they are engaged in livestock production, cattle production. But because the environment is a bit drier sometimes, usually they are nomadic, so they move towards the coastal belt, and they tend to come to countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Benin. But then when the environment is improved, they move back. But somewhere in the 1960s, there was severe droughts within the entire Sahel region. So most of the cattle producers, when they came to Ghana and other countries towards the coastal belt, they remain in those areas. Most likely. So when they came, initially, because the numbers were not so much, it wasn't an issue when they came, because there were still open spaces where they could raise their cattle. By the time, somewhere in Ghana, especially in Ghana, somewhere in the year 2000, 2010, 2015, there were intense confrontation between the farmers and the herders. So initially it was about getting access to feed their cattle. So as you can see on the far end here, we see based on cattle non-grazing, most of their crop farms were being destroyed. So in Ghana, after I think a period of time, here we have a entire community of farming community where they have to evacuate the area because of the presence of some of these Fulani herdsmen. So within the agro landscape, over time, there were this violent confrontation between the farmers and the herders, leading to a lot of cattle destruction. Initially, it was about crops and cattle destruction, but later on it became more fatal, where some of the farmers were being killed, some of them were being raped, and even some of the herdsmen were being killed. And somewhere around, I think, 2010, the local communities in Agogo, they took the case to a high court in Kumasi, and the courts ruled that the herdsmen should evacuate their cattle from the entire landscape. Let's go to the next slide. So for this particular study, what we did was that we wanted to follow the court evacuation process to see how the states went about the evacuation processes. And one of the key things that we see within the evacuation was the militarization of the evacuation process. In other words, so what happened was that the state employed the services of the police and the military, who used coercive means to evacuate the herdsmen from the area. So what happened is that within the landscape, even though the Fulanis were seen as people from the Sahel region, but when they came, some of them were able to acquire legal lands. So in Ghana, if you're a foreigner, you can still acquire lands when you have money. So they had lease agreements. But when the court gave the ruling, most of these, whether you have legal access to land or not, they were all included in the evacuation process. They were all sacked away. Some of the Fulanis, because they've come to Ghana and they live in Ghana for many years, most of them married, and some of them were even giving birth in the region. So in a sense, they have acquired legal kind of citizenship status, but the court did not make that distinction, and all those people were also included in the evacuation process. And the military and the police also, because they were being backed by the court decisions, mostly they were using coercive means. And sometimes because they have, sometimes some of them were even killing some of the cattle and they were illegally possessing them. But because of the court ruling, they were engaged in some of these activities. Let's go to the next slide. And so most of the Fulanis were left to wander. So basically, even though I'm using the word Fulani here, but then the cattle did not belong to the Fulani, because there were none of the indigenes who were also engaged in cattle production. But because it was difficult for the police and the military to really make a decision between Fulani cattle and the local cattle, they were all classified as what? Fulani kind of cattle. And so because the court gave the order, but then did not indicate where the herdsmen should move to, most of them were left to wander, and most of them were moved to different places. And as they moved to different communities, they were facing possibility from nearby communities. So for example, there was this particular person that I talked to, that even though the person was able to manage, he left the area where the conflict was occurring, but he moved to another area, but still the military and the police followed them in that area and so shot and killed their cattle, for instance. Let's go to the next slide. But prior to one of the key observations that you saw also in our case was that prior to the court ruling and the involvement of the military and the police services, the conflict was there, and the people were using compensation as a means to self-govern the arrangement. So, for example, I mean, the herdsmen were struggling to more or less like control their cattle. So sometimes the cattle would destroy crops, but they were using compensation means. So the farmers would come to them and tell them that my farm had been destroyed, and they were able to compensate them. So these were informal way that they were trying to mediate the conflict themselves. And sometimes they will use some of the local leaders to mediate conflict between them. But because of the military engagement and the fact that police was involved, and these informal mediation or self-governance systems, which were actually they were quite slow, they were not evolving so fast. But then all the systems had to collapse. And also because most of the local people, the farmers know that they could report the herdsmen for them to be, their cattle should be killed or arrested. Most of them were exaggerating the level of destruction that the herdsmen were giving, causing them. And because of that, the herdsmen were hiding, they were afraid. Most of them were afraid to come out in public, and they were hiding. And these informal kind of compensation systems tend to collapse. Let's go please. One of the other things that we saw in our study was the fact that the conflicts tend to change the nature of relation that the farmers and the herders were having in relation to land resources. So for example, if you look at the pastoralists, because of the nature of their work, they were surviving on what we call marginal lands. So within the landscape, the farmers were there, they have cultivated lands. 5 minutes. Thank you. But then there were marginal lands, open landscapes, and these open landscapes were where their livelihood were based on. But then, so they believe in this kind of open landscape, marginal lands, but with time, because of the conflict, all these marginal lands were disappearing, and it affected their livelihoods. And besides the livelihoods, it also affected, they personally saw it to be a fight against their cultural kind of identity, because culturally they have been nomadic, they move about. And so they need these marginal lands, open spaces for them to exist. That's how their livelihoods are. It's part of their culture. But then these marginal lands were disappearing. And so we see that this was a changing relation in terms of how they perceive land, the use of land resources. So this open system, this communal kind of shared landscape, that was their visions of how they relate to the environment. We saw that these systems were changing because of the conflict. On the other hand, next slide. So on the other hand, we see that farmers also have different way of relation they have with the land resources. They see land to be something that they have cultivated, something that because they have cultivated the land, they have transformed barren lands because if investors time to transform barren land is something that they have to own. They see land as a private kind of property, not a shared something, because they have used their energy, they have spent time, they have cultivated the land. So in that case, they see it to be something that they have to own. They are entitled to that kind of land. Next slide. So what we see, one of the key arguments that we see we raised in our paper was the fact that we think that the way the evacuation process went and followed Western land ownership kind of model, the private kind of ownership where there should be individual ownership or fixed boundaries. So the land belongs to these people, belongs to the farmers, the land is them. But using this approach tends to ignore the communal kind of or shared kind of ownership that the Fulani herders have. They have different versions. And you can see that the system that the evacuation process promoted did not put that kind of shared kind of or relational aspect of land ownership into consideration. And then we think that by following these models, the system tends to raise Fulani people their local environmental knowledge, which they have raised or generated over many years. Such systems have been eroded in the case. Also, we also see that we also read the argument that the issue of procedural and recompensative justice, because Fulanis were not put into consideration when making decisions as to what to do, where to send them. Those kind of issues were not taken care of, which we thought that such an approach is not the best way of going about it. Next slide. So our paper couldn't, we actually, in terms of conclusion, so this farmer-herder conflict in Ghana has been there for many years, and this approach of expelling the herdsmen, they've tried for many years and it doesn't work. And what we see is that always the herdsmen will be expelled, but then they come back again. So this kind of a vicious kind of cycle. So we ask questions like, how can land rights be redefined beyond Western notions of ownership, where we have individual property right? Because we see that always such framing are used to expel the herdsmen, but it doesn't work. And because the herdsmen also have different collective, they have collective understanding. And how do we incorporate such versions of relation towards land into the way that we see land as an individual kind of property? We also ask questions like what structural changes are needed in governance to meaningfully include Fulani herders in land inclusion, because the herdsmen have come to stay. Most of the locals have also, they are not in quote Fulani people, but they are also doing what Fulani people are doing. So what structural changes do we have to undertake in order to ensure that their versions or their ways of doing things are also included in land decision and making? And how can traditional Fulani ecological knowledge, such as the mobility-based grazing, be also integrated into national environmental policy framework? And the last question that we also asked is that what role can local institutions? Local institutions are very important because if you look at the case that we studied, these local chiefs and other local institutions, they are so close to farmers and the herders. So whenever they are conflict, they are the first call of action. How can these local institutions play, what role can they play in fostering inclusive and non-violent conflict solution that respect both farming and herding livelihoods? Thank you.